I was always taught heart disease is progressive. It's a part of aging. It's genetic. Yeah, you can lower your risk a little bit, maybe if you exercise or eat healthy, but that's not the big part of it. And that's backwards. I mean, the cause of heart disease is diet and lifestyle almost all the time. There's rare exceptions. And so that needs to be the primary treatment, but it's clearly not the primary treatment in our current healthcare system, which just kind of made me really angry, honestly. So I changed my diet, lost weight, and changed the way I practice medicine now.
Today's guest grew up, like so many of us, on the standard American diet. But after watching the seminal documentary, Forks Over Knives, Dr. Stephen Lome charted a new course in his life, both personally and professionally, by adopting a vegan diet, losing 100 pounds, and spreading the message about the healing power of plants. Dr. Lome is a board-certified cardiologist, the founder of the plant-based nutrition movement, and a member of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, where he fights to improve America's diet at a legislative level. And you may have heard about him in the news recently for his heroics at the Monterey Bay Half Marathon, which we're also going to talk about on the show. Dotsie and I are super excited to have him here today to share his passion for plant-based eating and discuss the benefits that it has on our cardiovascular health. Welcome, Dr. Lome, to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So we might as well start off with the story that I teased in the intro. My husband was scrolling Twitter and he saw just the story about you. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then I read the story, I'm impressed. And then I Google you and I find out you're a vegan and you have an amazing weight loss story. And so Dotsie and I were like, yeah, we want him on the show. So thank you so much for being here. And can you tell us what happened at this half marathon that went viral on social media not too long ago?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, thank you so much for having me on. And I'm very passionate about sharing the whole prevention story and hope to keep doing so. So yeah, it was about a month and a half ago. It was a beautiful morning, ready for a half marathon. I've run more than 10 full marathons and dozens of half marathons. So first one with my two older kids. So I was excited to have a nice time and then got running. It was, everything was going great. But at mile 3, about 20 to 30 feet in front of me, I saw a runner just collapse. And, I could tell pretty quick. He didn't just trip and fall down. He didn't just faint. He was running and just down he went, hit his head. And as I approached, could tell pretty quick, he had no pulse, wasn't breathing, and didn't look good. So immediately started CPR. And there were some other people that stopped to help, a nurse, a paramedic, and there was a neurosurgeon that helped to stabilize his neck. So a whole bunch of people stopped to help. And it took about 5 or 6 minutes before paramedics brought a defibrillator and we administered one shock to his heart and restarted his heart. He had a fatal arrhythmia called ventricular fibrillation. And without that, he wouldn't have made it. So it was,
he did make it.
Yeah, he did make it. So, and he ended up waking up and saying, what's going on here? What just happened to me? And we got him into the ambulance. He was stabilized and off to the hospital he was going. And so I knew he was in good hands at that point. And I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe this just happened in front of me. And thank goodness, we were able to get his heart back with one shock, one defibrillation. And, I was frazzled and I was like, well, my kids are way ahead of me now. There's no way I'm going to catch up with them. Should I finish the race? And so I decided to. It was, again, a beautiful day. So I kept running. And the whole time I'm running, I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe this happened. I'm thinking about him, hoping he's doing okay. Called and talked to the ER doctor and the cardiologist that was going to take care of him at the hospital. Finally crossed the finish line, throw my arms up in the air and say, yay, I finished. And I hear somebody say, I think we need some help over here. And I turned to the side and there was another runner down on the ground. Again, he hit his head and completely not breathing, unresponsive, no pulse. And started, chest compressions again. For a brief moment, I was like, you got to be kidding me. I can't believe this is happening again. But you got to act quick in these situations. And so started chest compressions on him. And really quickly, a race volunteer brought a defibrillator over. The medical tent is right by the finish line, thank goodness. Within a minute of me starting chest compressions, the defibrillator was there. We hooked him up, one shock. And I started chest compressions again after the shock. And just a few seconds later, he opened his eyes and again said, "What's going on? What am I doing down here?" And then, typical runner, he got on his watch and stopped his Strava and said, "Hey, I need to get up." And we're like, "No, you just died, and we shot your heart back, and you don't need to get up." And we eventually got him to the hospital, and both of these runners ended up having severe coronary artery disease, a blockage in the same artery, the left anterior descending. They both got stents put in, and both made complete full recoveries, which is absolutely amazing.
Wow. And so what a lot of us think, well, because they're athletic, there's, I run, so that means I can't have an issue with I'm healthy, I won't have a heart attack. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's definitely not true. You can never out exercise your diet if it's not the right diet. One of the runners even admitted I tried to out exercise my diet and my genes because he had a family history as well. And no, that doesn't work. And the general concept that a lot of lifestyle medicine physicians say is that maybe 20% of being healthy is exercise, but 80% of it is diet, predominantly diet related. And I, as I've been a cardiologist in practice for almost 13 years now, I've seen at least a dozen or more Ironman triathletes, marathon runners, elite cyclists end up having significant heart disease, coronary artery disease, despite how much they exercise. If you're not focusing on eating a very healthy diet that keeps your cholesterol numbers low, protects your endothelium from damage and inflammation, it doesn't matter how much you exercise. Actually, if anything, exercise might be harmful if you still have high cholesterol and you're eating unhealthy. Doing that degree of exercise can potentially accelerate the atherosclerosis, the plaque buildup in the arteries. So definitely diet by far is the most important part.
Mm-hmm. I know Alexandra, and I know she wants to do some kind of plug for taking a CPR class because she keeps up on hers. And a dear, dear friend of mine who I cycled with for many years, who used to be a coach of mine, a couple of Julys ago, we were cycling on a hot, sunny day. We split up to both go home. We were done with the ride. He was headed towards his home about 20 minutes out. I was headed the other direction. When we split up about 5 minutes later, he had a massive heart attack. Fell off his bike, got a traumatic brain injury, and he had a helmet on, but he died. A doctor was driving by this intersection, stopped and started to give him CPR. Now he's got his Garmin on his bike, and my husband and I went to get the Garmin from his bike that night to download, because at this point my friend is in a coma, which he was in for many weeks. So we wanted to see how long he was without oxygen, or how long his heart wasn't beating. 9 minutes and 20 seconds. So my husband and I we were hysterical, right? We're thinking he's a vegetable. And we're like, do we tell his family? Anyway, point being, because of that doctor knowing CPR, it kept oxygen in his system. And so that's one of the best plugs I can think of, Alexandra. He is alive and well. We hike every Saturday. He made a full recovery with his heart, but he's coming back from the TBI because that was pretty severe. But it's really important for all of us to know how to do that, chest compressions and then the mouth to mouth, who this doctor did in the middle of a pandemic, right? It was September of 2020. And this angel doctor is, going mouth to mouth in the middle of COVID. It's beautiful.
Well, which is crazy because there's a couple things I would say. First of all, the survival rate of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest is only 5%. During a marathon or half marathon, it's up to more like 30% because there's so many people around and defibrillators available. But I agree with you. Everybody should learn CPR. A formal class is the best way. But honestly, the new thing now that the American Heart Association is strongly advocating is what's called hands-only CPR. Not even using mouth to mouth, because a lot of people are afraid to do mouth to mouth, and that's why they won't. They'll just kind of look and they won't do anything because I don't want to do mouth to mouth, especially with COVID. And so hands-only CPR is really simple. Just push hard and fast in the center of the chest. And they always say, push to the song Staying Alive, because that's the proper beat. I heard rumor they were going to use a song, Another One Bites the Dust, but
okay.
Yes, I would do mouth to mouth because I was shocked when they told me, now, no, you don't have to do mouth to mouth. This was also after AIDS was a big thing in the early 80s and early 90s. People started people started thinking, well, maybe we shouldn't have to do mouth to mouth because it makes people afraid of helping at all. Yeah. But I personally would do mouth to mouth. That was just me. But I want to just say that you mentioned the AED, and when I was the last CPR class I was in, they emphasized the AED so much that it kind of irritated me, because I thought most times you might not have an AED. Now, if you have someone in your family, you can purchase one, I think, and I don't know how expensive they are. Maybe, but someone who might be vulnerable. But I also, so can you talk to us about the importance of knowing where the AED is when we're in a public place, like a school or somewhere? Like, where are they? Because I hear they're around.
Yeah, thank goodness they're around quite a bit nowadays. Certainly, every sporting event, there should be an AED there, whether it's a high school event, college, or professional. They're in airports, they're in grocery stores, they're all over the place. And it's nice to know where they are. But honestly, if you get somebody to call 911, hopefully paramedics should be able to be there within 5 minutes or so and bring one with if you don't know exactly where one is located. But the absolute key to survival for somebody having a cardiac arrest is early defibrillation, getting the heart beating. Chest compressions obviously help circulate blood a bit, but it's not anywhere near like a normal heartbeat. So you can't just sit there and do compressions for 30 minutes waiting for a defibrillator to arrive. That's no good. There won't be good enough blood flow to the brain, and there can be permanent, brain injury from that. So it's really important whenever you're somebody who's involved in racing events, whether it's a biking event, a running event, or football games, baseball games, basketball games, where anything can happen in big public places. Just know where a defibrillator is, have a general idea how to do CPR, and it's great to get formally trained, but it's really easy. It's actually meant to be really super simple. The defibrillator, once you hook it up, it tells you everything to do. It just says stop compressions, analyzing rhythm, and it tells you shock or no shock. It's that simple. It's meant for anybody.
How much do they cost? Can someone buy one for themselves if they have a loved one who has maybe already had a heart attack? If you've had a heart attack, the chances of having another heart attack can be quite high, especially if you don't have Dr. Lome as your doctor.
You can buy them on Amazon. They're about $1,000 or so. And they're honestly, it's not really a formal recommendation for everybody to have their own defibrillator in their house. Because the risk is relatively low. Paramedics can usually come quick, but if you're in a very high risk situation or you're around a place where there's more of a risk of an event happening, it's certainly nice to have one, know how to use it, and make sure it's available.
Mm. Well, thank you. So the American Red Cross and the American Heart Association, people just should go there and look for classes, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. There's even online classes. And if you don't have the chance, there's a very simple video. Just do a little search for American Heart Association, hands-only CPR. There's a really funny commercial with Ken Jeong, the comedian surgeon, where they show a very simple way to do hands-only CPR. Just push hard and fast in the center of the chest and call 911 and let the paramedics bring the defibrillator if you don't actually get formally trained yourself. So,
great. Thank you. Yeah. So let's talk about you. We mentioned in the intro that you did not eat the way that you eat now. So tell us a little bit about what kind of lifestyle did you lead in your childhood, your young adulthood, and your first years as a cardiologist that got you up to 250 pounds and not feeling really good?
Yeah. So it was very, almost kind of a typical story, I would say, is, I grew up on a standard American diet, eating all the standard American foods, burgers, fries, hot dog, pizza, processed foods. Basically, I ate what my culture told me to eat, what the food system provided, what tasted good, what was convenient. And it was not very healthy. And I went through all my medical training and didn't have any, nutrition training, or nobody ever said, hey, you should start eating healthy. It's good for prevention, et cetera. And, growing up, my sister reached 450 pounds. Both my parents were over 300 pounds. And honestly, the two main professors that trained me were 250 to 300 pounds. And it didn't really hit me at all because when you're young, you can still feel good and it doesn't really affect your health too much. But right around the age of 34 is when I started getting some obesity related health issues, some acid reflux, sleep apnea, blood pressure, getting more short of breath and fatigue. And I kind of had my own aha moment. My gosh, I have 6 kids. I can't keep up with them. I got to keep myself healthy. And that's when I realized, I don't know how. Nobody trained me in nutrition and how to lose weight. I just figured, I just need to exercise more and eat less. I could eat donuts still, just fewer donuts and fewer cookies and drink less soda, had all these wrong, things in my mind. But what was really interesting and unique, I think a lot of people have that realization they need to change their diet and get their health back in order. But I was also struggling as a cardiologist, meaning at that point in time, when I had my own personal health aha moment, I was also in my practice for about 4 years, and I was just not happy taking care of patients. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm just giving them pill after pill after pill after pill. And the patients don't like medications. They have side effects. They cost money. And even if I give them the perfect medication regimen, according to guidelines from the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology, a lot of times they still have heart attacks. They still have strokes. They need stents or bypasses. I'm like, something is really just missing here. And it didn't hit me that it's the lifestyle, that's the absolute critical thing. And it didn't hit me because my culture I had these blinders on, just thinking, food's not that important. If food and lifestyle was that important, that would have been the focus of my training, right? But I wasn't trained in that. And I remember sitting at my desk one day, and I was getting into the lifestyle medicine concept for myself and trying to integrate it into my practice. And I just said, let me just Google search a simple question. What percentage of heart disease is preventable? And the World Health Organization said greater than 80%, and other authorities think 90% or more. And then I thought, wait a second. Heart disease is the number one killer. It has been every year since 1919. More Americans die every year from heart disease than the number of American soldiers that die in combat in all wars in American history ever. And you're telling me it's 90% preventable? Like we know how to prevent it? Basically, if it's 90% preventable through lifestyle, that means the cause of heart disease is an unhealthy lifestyle, diet, and being sedentary and smoking cigarettes and all these things. It's not just genetic. I was always taught heart disease is progressive. It's a part of aging. It's genetic. Yeah, you can lower your risk a little bit, maybe if you exercise or eat healthy, but that's not the big part of it. And that's backwards. I mean, the cause of heart disease is diet and lifestyle almost all the time. There's rare exceptions. And so that needs to be the primary treatment, but it's clearly not the primary treatment in our current healthcare system, which just kind of made me really angry, honestly. So I changed my diet, lost weight, and changed the way I practice medicine now, where sure, I'll go through their testing and their medicines and listen to them, but then I try to spend as much of the visit as I can talking about lifestyle.
This was, the way I understand it, though, a little bit of the 2-step process. And the first step, when you realized after you Googled that's a fascinating story. Wow. And you look and you say, okay, it's lifestyle, not drugs. That's the key here. So you did what seems like a smart thing to do. You started following the USDA food guidelines closely. And you were also running, but you were right. You hadn't watched Forks Over Knives yet. You hadn't gone plant-based. You're doing what you think is the right thing. Okay, I'm really going to follow this food pyramid, but you're still overweight and you were still not feeling good. So what's going on with these food guidelines that the USDA puts out that you were following?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Of course, I'm thinking to myself, the government's not going to lie to us, right? It's got to be, got to be the right thing to do. So yeah, I read those USDA guidelines twice, and chicken, fish, low-fat dairy products, olive oil. You can still have processed foods, just don't overeat it. Moderation, and that and the more I think about things and reflect back, I mean, things that are bad for you shouldn't be done in moderation. You shouldn't do heroin and cocaine in moderation.
No.
You shouldn't smoke cigarettes in moderation. Things that are bad for you, it should be zero, right? And that's the same with processed foods. And then, okay, fine. I did lose some weight with exercising and cutting out, the donuts and the cookies and such. But, I was eating lots of chicken and fish, low-fat dairy. Looked at my cholesterol numbers. They were still high. And I wasn't feeling the energy. And I also did reach a plateau. I kind of couldn't get that next step to get to my ideal body weight as a 6 foot tall guy. I wanted to get down to 170, and I was kind of stuck in that 183, 185, despite running, a couple marathons already at that point. And it wasn't until I watched Forks Over Knives and I thought, geez, chicken in many surveys is the number one source of cholesterol in the American diet, is either chicken or eggs, which came first, chicken or eggs. And olive oil still has saturated fat. It's very calorie dense. And as I learned a lot of these things, I was just like, wow, this makes complete sense. So I cut them out and went on 100% whole food, plant-based, low-fat diet. And oh my gosh, the last, 10 pounds, I actually lost almost 20 more pounds. I got down to 163 at one point, just melted right off, and my energy went up, and my LDL cholesterol dropped from 135, which is higher than the average American. And that was despite following those USDA dietary guidelines and having lost weight and exercised. It dropped down to 60, which is like what some people would call that heart attack proof level. And I was like, wow, 60. But I was eating chicken and fish, and I was avoiding cheese and processed foods, yet my numbers were still so high. And there's, everybody's different how their cholesterol reacts to dietary changes, but clearly I had found what was right for me and for my body. Yeah.
This extraordinary transformation makes me want to know about the people in your life. You have 6 children. You have a wife and 6 children, and your patience and how this, this big transformation for you that's probably saved your life has a ripple effect. We've talked to many guests that are whole food plant-based that have, 2 kids to 7 kids. And we read that all 6 of your kids are plant-based.
That is right.
And
my
that
wife.
is no parents can get all 6 of us. So that the parents out there are going to want to know how in the world you convinced or cajoled or bribed all 6 kids to go whole food plant-based. And what are their ages too? Because that'll help people.
Yeah. Well, right now the youngest is 4, the oldest is 16. At the time, we only had 4 kids when we made the change. And honestly, what I tell parents is the way you got to think about it is your kids shouldn't be the ones who decide what they eat, because they would eat candy all day, right? That's why they would drink soda, eat candy and cookies, right? You'd have to decide for them. You have to tell them what's right for them. And, obviously, if you lead by example and you do the right things, then they'll follow. And you just cannot give into it. If you let your kid choose what to do, they play video games all day and they would just never go to school. It's like, no, we say you can't play video games all day. You have to go to school and do your homework, and obviously keep it positive and encouraging, but be a good example and teach them the right way. Now, obviously, kids have a hard time understanding the health aspects of it. And you never want to be too harsh on it and emphasize things too much. Everybody gets concerned about kids developing eating disorders and such if you go too crazy, but you just, again, lead by example, and they'll thank you for it later on. A lot of times what works for the kids is not emphasizing the health aspects, it's the environmental aspects or the ethical aspects, because it's a natural instinct for kids to say, I don't want to harm animals. So you can always play that route too, which helps them to avoid, the animal products. And getting the kids 100% whole food plant-based is a challenge. As long as you can do that 90% of the time, they're going to be in way better shape than almost any other kid. And if the occasional processed plant-based food comes in there, as long as it's, not often and not a daily staple, they're still going to be way, way healthier than almost every other kid that doesn't follow a plant-based diet. Because honestly, the diet of American kids is horrific. A lot of processed foods, high fat animal foods, high sugar. And any step you could take away from that is definitely a step in a positive direction.
Yeah. Don't ask Johnny what he wants to eat it when he's 2. Like, it's not a question.
Yes, right. You got it.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch4Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch4Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch4Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch4Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
How does your teenager, how does your teenager do with his or her friends? Because peer pressure is pretty strong when you're a teenager, but there's also a lot of feeling of rebellion, and being plant-based is kind of rebellious.
It is a little bit, yeah.
And
yeah.
also, young people care about how they look and their bodies changing and things like that. So what does your teenager get pressure?
Well, so far they haven't had, as far as they told me, my two teenagers have not had any problems at all with friends. They actually have all been very, very open and happy all about it. So my daughter's a cross country runner. She's on the varsity team. There's 2 other vegan runners on their team out of 7 in the varsity. So she's not alone there. And I think there's one vegetarian as well. And one of the coaches is vegan and does all these ultra runs and such. So she hasn't had a hard time at all. And actually it's been very much embraced by her friends. And my son, he's got a lot of friends, and he goes over and he sleeps over at people's house. They are always really, really accommodating. Now that's when some people have a hard time and they're like, I don't know what to feed him. And then there comes the Beyond Burgers and the more processed foods and such. But, if it's that rare occasion again, it's better than eating, animal-based for sure.
Okay. So what about your patients? How did you start approaching them with this idea of lifestyle instead of a pill?
Well, I actually honestly think that's become easier and easier. And the reason it's become easier really is the work of all the researchers publishing more and more data on plant-based diets and heart disease. And one man specifically, Kim Williams, past president of the American College of Cardiology, who's on the guideline writing committees for hypertension and prevention of heart disease. I can say, because of a lot of his efforts, that the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology guidelines for how we prevent heart disease recommend a plant-based diet. And it's formally in the guidelines. It's not like I'm some crazy doctor telling you some weird, restrictive diet to follow. This is in the guidelines. This is what the science has shown. And when you tell people, like we mentioned previously, how preventable heart disease is through proper lifestyle changes, and you say the most effective thing is to treat the cause of the problem, it's just common sense, they get it. They understand it. Here's a challenge. They'll get that part, that lifestyle is critical. It's the most important part. It's actually doing it is always the problem, the barrier, the obstacle. I would estimate that if I talk to 20 patients with heart disease for an hour and go through everything, diet and being whole food plant-based and the cholesterol and the saturated fat, cholesterol numbers, weight loss, exercise, all these things, endothelial injury, you name it, 1, maybe 2 will become predominantly or exclusively plant-based, 1 or 2 out of 20. So it's because there's so many barriers, honestly. Our culture is very into unhealthy food and processed foods. Our food system really pushes, promotes, advertises, markets, and provides us all these unhealthy foods. And then our government policies, subsidize the wrong stuff. We should be giving away apples and fruit and beans for free to people. That would lower healthcare costs if we just made those healthy, unprocessed plant-based foods free. And then, of course, you have our healthcare system, which does nothing to help people with this because prevention is a money-losing field. And lastly, it's just our brains. We love sugar, salt, and fat. That's the way we've evolved for survival purposes. So we could go out and get a lot of calories and not starve to death. But of course, we're not starving now. It's quite the opposite. We're overfed, yet at the same time undernourished because it's predominantly processed foods and animal foods without the proper nutrients that we really need. And so you put all these things together And it's really hard for patients to make the right change. And it's kind of, when I watched Forks Over Knives and had my aha moment, I became kind of angry at our healthcare system that we haven't stepped up and done more to make this easier. One of the things I think about, like if you had a cure for cancer and there was some chemo drug, but the side effects were horrible, hair falls out, you throw up, lose weight, but it cured all cancer, it cost $100,000. We would do everything we could to help somebody tolerate that therapy and get through all that difficult time, right? Because there's so much money in this, they would work really hard to make sure that chemo drug was going to work. But we kind of have that for heart disease. It's not a chemo drug. It's a diet, and it's a clean, healthy diet where the food can be great and taste great. You can still eat all the things you want. You'll lose weight, get off your medications, reverse your disease. Yet we haven't done anything to help people get on this diet and prevent the heart disease. Why? Because it doesn't cost any money. There's no profit in it. You can't patent a plant-based diet. You can't patent broccoli, although I heard Monsanto is trying to, but it's just, there's no money in these things. And it's just really sad, because we should step up as a healthcare system and say, I know this isn't necessarily the profitable model, but this is the right thing to do. And we need to make it easy for people to make these changes and get on plant-based diets every single way that we can, just like we would make it easy for somebody to tolerate some chemo drug if it cured all cancer. We would work hard at that. But we're just not making enough efforts to help people get on a healthy, clean diet. And there's so many barriers, predominantly, financial, which is really unfortunate.
And just pure human greed, right, from the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors that don't really want to turn to the light. It's hard to make money if you, as we know, and have had many lifestyle doctors on the podcast, right? If you sit with somebody for an hour and really talk to them about changing their diet versus peddling a pill, that's going to be a tough road to making a living.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah. Actually, some surveys had showed that the lowest paid doctor in the United States was a preventive medicine specialist. It's either that or a pediatrician, right? Which is horrible, because you would think those should be the highest paid doctors, but the highest paid is a plastic surgeon, of course. So that's America. So it's backwards, and it is changing. But like everything in our world, the change is just way too slow, and it's way too painful, and it needs to be sped up as much as possible. What's nice is by 2030, Medicare is going to pay doctors and hospitals only for quality of care, not quantity of care. And that then will shift things away from how many patients are you seeing, how many surgeries are you doing, to are you doing the right thing for your patients? And you're going to see a bigger shift towards lifestyle medicine, as big healthcare systems will only get paid if the diabetic patients are controlled well, and the blood pressure is controlled, and people lose weight and don't have heart attacks and don't get hospitalized. Now, of course, the drug companies are going to try to find medications to achieve those goals and control the sugars and the blood pressures and prevent the heart attacks. But we have it in front of our face, and that's a lifestyle medicine model. That's what we need to push.
Mm-hmm. What do you tell when you're talking to them, your patients? What are the first 3 steps or so that you might tell them to do? Because it can get overwhelming, and you're not there with them every day for the first 6 months. So what do you tell them first, and how do you follow up and support them, if at all?
Well, it's super challenging, and that's the art of medicine, honestly. And the reason is every patient's so different. And so you need to really kind of get a feel for each patient, how much change they're capable of, what their situation is, how they were raised on their diet, what they eat now, who do they live with, who can help them, do they have a support system, do they have time to be able to do more of these things. And a really good model would have, a nurse educator or a nutritionist in the clinic to make sure that the time can be spent, going through, food logs and diaries and giving resources for cooking and following up on things and weight checks and all these things. But a lot of offices don't have those things in place because, again, you don't make money on this. So healthcare systems won't hire the staff really to support a program the way that it really should be. And so many times doing a formal program like a CHIP lifestyle medicine program, where it's all set up and you have a curriculum and patients come in every so often and go through the program, is a very nice way for people to get something going which can have a model that healthcare systems may actually go for because it can actually make a little bit of money, at least not lose money. And so we've been trying to get one of those programs going here. But it's a challenge. You just, sometimes I'm like on my hands and knees saying, please just eat an apple a day. And it's hard to just get somebody to do that, versus, again, you get those people who go in the refrigerator, throw everything out, and they're really, really ready to go and do a lot of things. I do refer to some local nutrition people here. I have an email I send my patients, which has a very, very well written, I think, simplified explanation, for high blood pressure, for weight loss, for cholesterol and heart disease prevention, explaining it all, giving links and resources, videos, recipe websites, online support groups, books you can read, food delivery services, all these different things, because, they hired me here to be a cardiologist, not to be a lifestyle medicine doctor. So they're not letting me spend an hour with every single patient all the time, which is, that's the reality of our healthcare system. So you got to do the best you can with the resources you have and the time you have, and just keep pushing forward to try to get administration to hire up and put more of an investment into this. And we're going to see more and more of that as the reimbursement models change. Healthcare systems will embrace it more as we, making some positive changes here locally where I am in Monterey. So,
yeah. For our listeners, I want them to know that the good doctor here is on call. So if you hearing that beep, it's not Alexander and me. He has to keep the phone on to make sure that there's not an emergency. I want to go back to something you said about the Beyond Burger, because I think I've heard that. I feel like I hear it almost every day. Oh, it's worse for you than the real thing. And you had mentioned something, like it's not. And when your kids go over to family, that they'll throw a Beyond Burger on. And when you look at the ingredients, it's certainly some good proteins, and it makes a complete protein because it's beans and the brown rice. So, because it's gotten flack of that, but it does make a complete protein. It's got pea protein in it. It's got mung beans in it, but it also has a canola oil, refined coconut oil, and cocoa butter, which I think all three of those would be something that you probably wouldn't recommend as a salad dressing or on a piece of toast. So talk us through why it's better than the animal-based version.
Well, there's actually a few different reasons, more than one reason. So we got to think about both the number one killer and the number two killer. Number one killer being heart disease, number two killer being cancer. First of all, red meat is very strongly linked to more than one different type of cancer. Processed meats even more. So we already have solid research to say that red meat is really bad for cancer risk, no question, and very, very similar for heart disease risk, heart attack, stroke, atherosclerosis, clogging of arteries. So, we already have that data. Now, nobody's done randomized controlled clinical trials of Beyond Burger versus, a red meat burger. So we can't really make conclusions about risk of a Beyond Burger. All we could do is kind of analyze the ingredients, like you were saying, and try to think, are the ingredients within a Beyond Burger lower risk, same risk, or higher risk than what you would think you get from an actual red meat burger? From a heart disease perspective, red meat will have not only cholesterol in it, but a lot of saturated fat. And the animal-based protein is certainly much more acidic and is much stronger linked to overall all-cause mortality in many different publications, including heart disease. And it has to do with the types of amino acids that are in there being more acidic, et cetera. But it clearly, we know that's linked, whereas the plant-based proteins are not linked with early death or all-cause mortality. So right there, we have the animal protein versus plant protein benefit when you compare the two. We know that plant-based foods have no cholesterol in them. And while dietary cholesterol might not be as critical as saturated fats are, they're still important. And so the statement from the National Academy of Medicine says individuals should eat as little cholesterol as possible while consuming a healthy eating pattern. Well, as little as possible, zero, because cholesterol is not an essential nutrient. You're going to get cholesterol if you eat red meat. You don't get any cholesterol in a Beyond Burger. Now, they make a very similar statement about saturated fat, that they did not set an upper limit for how much saturated fat is safe to eat, because any saturated fat you eat above zero, any amount, will raise your LDL cholesterol number, and LDL is so critical. When you think about red meat, there's a significant amount of saturated fats in there. Coconut oil, there's a lot of saturated fat in coconut oil.
Yeah. There's
you were to
6
compare a
grams
red
of
meat
saturated
burger,
fat in the Beyond Burger, like 20 total. They've made a
yes,
lower fat version now that's 14, but
they did.
yeah.
Absolutely. So when you compare directly which one has more saturated fat, it's the red meat burger
Mhm.
is going to have more saturated fat than the Beyond Burger.
How much
So
saturated fat in a regular meat burger
I don't
that
know the
size?
exact number, but it's probably half or less in the Beyond Burger compared to a red meat
Okay.
burger. And it depends on what type of red meat, how lean it is that you're
Sure.
getting. But it's going to be less saturated fat in the Beyond Burger. So if you just analyze the actual ingredients, having plant protein, no cholesterol, and less saturated fat, I mean, that's a winner right there. There's no question that if America shifts away from red meat burgers to Beyond Burgers, there is going to be a significant reduction in heart disease risk. Is there going to be any cancer risk from eating processed foods? Probably not. Honestly, I mean, we have no reason to suspect that any of the ingredients in the Beyond Burger are going to increase the risk of cancer, but we already know that red meat does. We already know it. So it is a huge step in the right direction to eat a Beyond Burger over a red meat burger. Now, of course, even better would be to eat a black bean burger of some kind, but it is what it is.
I just looked it up, and it looks like a 6-ounce Beyond Meat burger, which is what they are, is, as you said, Dotsie, did you say it was 6 ounces of saturated fat? In a red meat burger has twice that.
6 grams. Yeah. About twice that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That makes
so
sense.
You're right on.
And that's their original one. They've created a 30% lower fat one that's 14 grams of regular fat, and I think it's like 4 saturated fat. So you can get a leaner Beyond Meat burger if you want now.
Yeah. Where do you come down on just fat in general? Is it important that people lower their polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fat content too, or is it just saturated and trans fats we should be looking at?
Well, I think it's individualized, honestly. And what is lost a lot of times in medicine, whether it's the typical Western medicine with medications or lifestyle medicine, talking about diet and such, is there is a lot of individual variability from person to person, how they respond to things. Just like we know that 30% of people are hyper responders when they go plant-based, their cholesterol numbers plummet. About 50% have a moderate change. About 20%, their cholesterol numbers only go down a much smaller amount. There's a lot of individual variability, and it's the same thing with the ability to tolerate higher fat in the diet. Obviously, we want to avoid the saturated fats, no question. And the more polyunsaturated, just the healthier fats, eating. There's fat in everything too. If you think about, I remember when I talk about should we be oil free, et cetera, you get people, oh my gosh, you need fats, you're going to die without fats. It's like, well, broccoli is 10% fat. People don't realize there's fat in everything. We just want to avoid being super high fat. And almost anything, even avocado and such, olives and nuts and seeds have some saturated fats in them. So when you think about a person's individual situation, if they have heart disease or stroke or some other vascular disease or a very, very high risk based on family history and risk factors, you're going to want to make sure that the fat content is low enough that you get your LDL cholesterol down less than 70 at least. And so you're doing good with reducing fat in your diet if your weight is good, because obviously fat is much more calorie dense and can lead to weight gain if you overconsume it. So if you're at your ideal body weight, if your LDL cholesterol is less than 70, and if your inflammation markers are negative, then what you're doing is right. And so we try to target those things. It's hard to achieve, perfection, but many people certainly can. So if you don't have heart disease, adding some healthy fats in there, some avocado and nuts and seeds, I'm okay with it as long as everything else looks fine. Your weight's good, your LDL's good, you're not having any inflammation in your system. So I think the Esselstyn diets and the Ornish diets, which a lot of people label as, more difficult to follow, they're a little bit more strict. Those are much more important for people with documented vascular disease or a very, very high risk. But you could be a little bit, in order to help you maintain the diet a little bit better, in the long term, you could be a little bit loose with the fats as long as you're watching your risk factors and you're doing, your numbers all look good.
Mm-hmm. And lean into the whole fats. So a walnut instead of walnut oil.
Mm-hmm. Oh, of course. Okay. Of course. Yeah. You really want to avoid the processed fats as you can. Now, I mean, certainly we always think about things, what is the most harmful, what is less harmful, and what is ideal. Ideal is to get your fats from whole unprocessed plant-based foods. If there was going to be any oil in the diet, keeping the type of oil lower in saturated fat's important. So olive oil, that's why olive oil gets such a lot of attention, is because it's only about 15% saturated fat versus coconut oil, which is 80 or 85% saturated fat, and palm oil very high in saturated fat. So canola oil is lower in saturated fat, avocado oil's a little bit lower in saturated fat. But again, it's still fat, it's processed, it's calorie dense. If you happen to be ideal body weight, your LDL is good, and you have just this very small amount of olive oil or canola oil, it's not going to be devastating to your health. But the problem is people think, oh, these oils are so good for me. They're like dousing everything with like tons and gallons of like olive oil all over the place. And then they're like, why am I not losing weight? Or why is my LDL still high? It's like, well, it's still a lot of fat and it's a lot of calories. It might be better. And I get it. It's confusing when you look at the research and you look at the way that the scientific community even kind of portrays olive oil as being so healthy for you. It could be confusing. And when you look at the data and the research, a lot of the research that shows olive oil is good for you is really eliminating or what should I should say, substituting olive oil for animal-based fats. So it's like saying, if you remove the beef fat and instead have olive oil, oh, look, you do better. You have fewer heart attacks, fewer strokes. Well, that's because you're dropping the cholesterol and the saturated fat content is lower. Does that mean olive oil is good for you? Or is it just simply less harmful for you than animal-based fat is? Now, if you had a part of that research study that had no oil and no animal fat, are you going to do better? Maybe for sure. And the funny analogy that I use for this is it's kind of comparing, if you have a research group and one side you give a bunch of cyanide and the other side you give a bunch of arsenic, and you go, oh, look, the people who are getting the arsenic, they're not dying so fast. Ooh, arsenic must be good for you, right? Because if you give cyanide, man, they die real quick. And so everybody's like, hey, arsenic's good for you. Well, not really. Arsenic's not good for you. It's just less harmful. It'll kill you slower than the cyanide will. And that's what we call a substitutionary benefit. You substitute one thing for another. You're substituting in these studies the olive oil for the beef fat or the animal fat, and you think it's better, but it's not really better. It's just less harmful. That's all.
Yeah, it's what I learned years ago and continue to see show up every day in studies. Is first of all, read the methods section, people. You can't just read right the first page or the abstract, because the methods tell you everything. And I wanted to ask a question about a recent dairy study that it's pretty new research that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, suggesting that saturated fat in dairy may be beneficial for cardiovascular disease risk. And when I dug deeper and worked with our scientists to dug deeper, it was kind of the typical dairy study where it was a gross overadjustment and many of the methods that they did. One of them is the author writes that saturated fats from both dairy and non-dairy sources were adjusted for body weight, which certainly seems like an overadjustment, because we know that these dietary constituents here in the study increase body weight. So why would we control why would they control or attempt to eliminate the effects of that? And it's like, okay, like what you were saying earlier, it's like studying the relationship between cigarette smoking and dying early, but controlling for lung cancer, heart disease, and stroke, right? If A goes to B goes to C, then eliminating B from the chain is a very big problem. And I feel like we see this over and over, but the media just sees the abstract, and it's like, oh, yes, dairy's fantastic and doesn't have has benefits for cardiovascular health.
There have been dozens of studies over the past 10 or 20 years that have said saturated fats are good for you. They don't increase cardiovascular risk. But there have been hundreds of studies that say the opposite, right? But every time one shows it's not harmful, that's when the media runs with it, because everybody likes to hear good news.
Everybody wants their cheeseburger.
You're absolutely, yeah. And every single time you look into these research studies and look who funded it, how the methods were, how they controlled things, you're always going to find major issues. And honestly, we are incentivized as researchers in the medical world to publish studies that show some kind of an impactful outcome. And, it skews things. It skews the research, or it introduces bias. If they did this big study and it didn't show anything, the journal's not going to publish it. And so they're always going to do some statistics, some way to show some kind of a meaningful number. And it's just really wrong. There's so many issues with this. And that's why you got to look at the funding, the research, the methods. And then even if there was one study that showed some outcome that contradicts the general consensus about diet, you can't just make any conclusion based on one study. You have to look at the entirety of research, entirety of all the studies that have been published. And it's not just clinical trials. You got to look at other things such as, epidemiologic studies. You have to look at population-based studies like the blue zones that, didn't really have high-fat dairy predominantly as a predominant part of their diet. And when you put the basic science in there, where we know the cholesterol and the saturated fat's bad for you, and the animal protein's not good for you, you kind of put all the different pillars of research together. It's pretty obvious that that high-fat dairy is not good for you and not good for cardiovascular health. But there's so much money in this. America is one of the very few countries now that have not removed dairy as a part of their food guide, as it having its own food group. Canada has removed it. Most European countries have removed it. But still, on the United States food plate, there's a big thing right there in the corner: dairy, 3 servings, low fat. We'll get there eventually, but it is very unfortunate that the media runs with these headlines. It confuses people, and it's wrong. I always tell my patients, you have to go by guidelines from the major medical societies who say a plant-based diet is the way to go, which excludes dairy.
Yeah. I was thinking about cholesterol as well, because I feel like there are a few studies that came out, and this is always banter about cholesterol, that consuming cholesterol, this is the other side, right? Oh, it's been shown that consuming cholesterol has nothing to do with your actual cholesterol score, which just doesn't even make any sense when you say that out loud. But we've seen that a few different times.
Oh, yeah. And that's because of how they do the research. So there was a big deal back, I believe it was 2010, when they were doing the dietary guidelines for Americans. And the egg industry funded a bunch of research, which showed that if you add some eggs to your diet, it didn't really change your cholesterol numbers, right? So you take somebody who already has a high cholesterol content in their diet, a higher saturated fat content, you add a little bit more, it doesn't really budge the numbers much, right? And so they know how to design these studies to get the outcome they want. And so they kind of told the USDA writing committee, oh, look, you add more eggs, it doesn't change your cholesterol numbers, no big deal. The funny analogy that you think about for that is, now I'm in California, marijuana is legal in California. I don't smoke marijuana myself, but here's the analogy, is if you smoke one joint, I hear people get really, really high from smoking one joint. You smoke a second joint, a third one, nothing. Doesn't give you any more extra benefit, right? That's kind of like what eating really cholesterol is in your diet. Yeah, if you're eating a bunch of cholesterol in it, boom, your LDL cholesterol will go way up if you just start eating some cholesterol, right? But if you add some more, add a couple eggs, it only goes up a teeny bit. Add like 5 eggs, doesn't budge. You're already saturated. You've already eating so much cholesterol. Adding more is not going to raise your blood cholesterol numbers more. But here's the key: when you do controlled feeding studies, what they call metabolic ward studies, where they literally lock people in and they control everything they eat and monitor their cholesterol numbers, any amount of cholesterol in the diet raised the LDL cholesterol. Hence the statement from the National Academy of Medicine that said, we did not set a limit for how much dietary cholesterol is safe to eat, because any cholesterol that is consumed will raise your LDL cholesterol number, any amount above 0% of energy. And that is, again, a statement from one of the biggest medical organizations in the world saying that. And that's based on metabolic controlled feeding studies where you literally lock people in and control everything. So we need to not let the egg industry and these other industries fund these research studies to confuse people. And then when doctors found out about how the USDA guidelines were going to maybe say that cholesterol was no longer a nutrient of concern, they all freaked out and said, no, this is wrong, and kind of educated the USDA writing committee about all these metabolic feeding studies and all these things. And they didn't end up saying that. They ended up saying, don't eat any cholesterol. They went from cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern, which was a push by the egg industry, to going completely the opposite direction, saying don't eat any cholesterol at all. And that's where it stands today, more than a decade later.
Because our body makes cholesterol. We have to remember that it makes what it needs, because apparently you do need some, but your body makes it. You don't need to add it. through
It is
food.
not an essential nutrient, right? Yeah.
So high cholesterol is one of the risk factors for heart disease. What are the others that people need to start paying attention to when they get their stats done or their lifestyle factors?
Yeah, certainly just really quickly on cholesterol, it is considered the most important risk factor. The prerequisite for building plaque in your coronary arteries is an LDL over 70. There's a really good article. You can just do a little Google search called "It's the Cholesterol Stupid." I didn't write the title, but it was an editorial in one of the biggest cardiology journals, which kind of explains the simple concepts as to why cholesterol is so important. And they pretty much conclude there is no evidence that if your LDL is under 70, there's no evidence that smoking will clog your arteries, that being sedentary, obese, diabetic, or having high blood pressure will clog your arteries. So the prerequisite for clogging your arteries is having an LDL cholesterol over 70.
But smoking, just to be clear, smoking doesn't clog it. It makes them so they're not pliable. Isn't that right? And it damages them.
Hardens them, right?
There's two things you need really to build up plaque. You need the LDL over 70, and you need damage and inflammation to your arteries, right? And that's where the smoking comes in. It damages the arteries, it inflames the arteries. And so if you have a combination of LDL over 70 plus your arteries being inflamed and damaged, that's when you build up plaque. Now, of course, the number one thing that ends up damaging and inflaming the arteries is diet. Eating processed foods and high-fat animal-based foods is the worst thing to do. But other things like secondhand smoke and tobacco, it will damage and inflame the arteries. But other risk factors, we think about blood pressure. Normal blood pressure is less than 120 over 80. More than 50% of adult Americans, it's 70% of adult Americans over the age of 50. 70% of adult Americans over the age of 50 have high blood pressure. And a lot of that's because 80% or more of America is overweight now or obese. And those go hand in hand.
Now, why do they go hand in hand, though? It doesn't seem to really make sense. I thought high blood pressure came from the damaged, inflamed arteries, or the arteries that were unable to flex properly.
Blood pressure is very complex. It's actually hormonal. There's a lot of endocrine system, adrenaline, and some kidney hormones that control blood pressure. It also has to do with arteries and veins and their flexibility, their compliance. There's even things that relate to brain, the brain that actually controls blood pressure quite a bit. So it is very complex. But one of the big things, the most common cause of difficult to control high blood pressure, where people need 3 or more medications, is something called sleep apnea, where people snore and stop breathing, which is markedly increased when people are overweight or obese because their neck gets really big and it blocks their airway. And so out of all lifestyle measures that could be done for somebody with high blood pressure, the one thing that has the most impact by far is weight loss. Weight loss is the most powerful thing to do to get your blood pressure under control. And part of that might be because sleep apnea improves significantly as you lose weight.
Okay.
Yeah. And other things, of course, other risk factors, diabetes, tobacco use. There is a genetic part of it, but like you hear for diabetes and high blood pressure and other things, the genes load the gun, but your diet and lifestyle pulls the trigger. Having a pure genetic heart disease where lifestyle means nothing is extraordinarily, I don't think I've ever seen it really. I mean, it's extraordinarily rare. I think one time as a medical student, I saw a 21-year-old need to have bypass surgery because he had a genetic high cholesterol and his LDL was 500. But that's not a common thing at all. So it's very rare that it's purely genetic.
Yeah. I want to ask you about endothelium. They beat that to death, I think, in the Game Changers. But it was really, it's really
so important.
It's so important. It's really powerful when you talk about food and antioxidants, right, and fiber-rich diet, and how much those maintain a healthy endothelium. So for people that just need a refresher, that it is the membrane that lines the inside of the heart and blood vessels, and then endothelial cells release other things that are good for us and control things like blood clotting, and even our immune system. Where it doesn't seem like there's any evidence that would show that not having a healthy endothelium is okay or good for you. And it's pretty clear that eating a plant-based diet, like I just said, that's high in antioxidants and fiber, are extreme, and other things, right? Exercise and rest, but we're talking about diet right now, that are extremely important in maintaining this endothelial. Like you can't find anywhere that it says eggs help. I mean, they haven't even bothered to try to do that study because it's not going to fly.
Right.
How critical is this endothelial, and can we keep it healthy into our 80s and 90s? And how do we do that?
No, yeah, absolutely. It is very important. It is critical. Maybe LDL cholesterol is a little bit more important, but endothelial health is insanely important as well. So the thing is, when you think about the way I describe it to patients is you think about what might damage your endothelium and what might not. We know processed foods and animal-based foods, for the most part, they do cause endothelial injury, and they measure it by something called a brachial tourniquet test, where they actually inflate a blood pressure cuff on your arm for a very, very long time and use an ultrasound to see, after you release the pressure, how much does the artery dilate, and that kind of is a good idea, or a good measure of endothelial function. So they'll feed people different foods and different things and see what their endothelial function is, and it kind of helps guide us to figure out what's causing damage and what's not. So the important thing, though, is really what we look at to really get guidelines written and medical practice changed is what's going to actually impact the patient directly. How are we going to prevent a heart attack, prevent a stroke? And so the criticism of using the endothelium technique and thinking of it this way is, how can you prove to me that avoiding a certain substance that has been shown to cause damage to the endothelium is really going to prevent a heart attack or a stroke? It makes sense that it should. But one of the things that Dr. Esselstyn, for example, excludes from his diet is caffeine, because the brachial tourniquet test, when they did it, it showed caffeine causes endothelial dysfunction. Whereas there's not a lot of research. Actually, there's really no good solid evidence to say that caffeine increases heart attack and stroke risk, as long as you're not, drinking 10 pots of coffee a day and overdosing on it. And so it's super important from a conceptual perspective to understand why it is we recommend whole food plant-based, because in general, you're going to keep your endothelium from being damaged and inflamed. But it's not really the holy grail. It's not like the absolute most critical piece that we need to look at. It's important to understand the general concept. When you are, this is just for a healthy person who doesn't have coronary disease or vascular disease. Now, when you do have vascular disease, it is even more so important at that point, because now you're at a situation where you need to do everything you can to protect your endothelium, keep your LDL down, and protect your endothelium so it doesn't become inflamed, and you have you don't want a plaque to become unstable. And so in those instances, that's when Dr. Esselstyn will have you eat a ton of green leafy vegetables, the arugulas and the bok choy, the high nitrate containing foods, and he wants some balsamic vinegar on there to activate the nitrates. And by bathing your endothelium in this natural nitric oxide and allowing it to heal up, and eventually hopefully getting some degree of reversal, the outcomes make sense. In theory, will be improved. And there's a little data to show that, but of course, not enough for the medical community to really advocate it, to a large degree, but it makes common sense that would help. And so, and there's no harm in it, right? You're not going to hurt anything by doing that. So might as well give it a shot and keep your endothelium as healthy as you possibly can.
You just mentioned nitrates and then nitric oxide. I understand the nitric oxide a lot as an athlete and beets because I certainly feel
beet juice.
Yeah, it's really it really does improve the oxygenation. I feel like 5 to 10%. I mean that's just what it feels like. But nitrates are bad, right? That's what's in processed meat, like in hot dogs.
Oh yeah, so it's a little confusing. Yeah, so there's different type of nitrates. You want nitric oxide. Nitrates can be a precursor to nitric oxide, but nitrates themselves, when they're added to processed meats, they are carcinogenic.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So it's a little bit different. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
You want nitric oxide. So you want there's so many different types, but you want the ones that are going to turn into nitric oxide. Yeah. So thanks for clarifying that.
Yes. Okay. We don't want people to get a bunch of hot dogs with nitrates.
No. That's not good.
This is not the case. Fabulous.
So much great information. Before we go, if you could just tell us all about plant-based nutrition movement and 6 million seeds. I'm sure they'd love to hear about all the great work you're doing outside your office.
Yeah. So Plant-Based Nutrition Movement was a great organization, nonprofit organization in Chicago when I was back over at Rush University. And, I got very enthusiastic. Oh my gosh, we need to change the healthcare system. How is it going to change unless we actively step up and be the change ourselves? So, I kind of got on the Meetup app and social media and said, hey, everybody meet at Rush University, whoever wants to help in the community to spread this message and get things going. And much to my surprise, we had more than 100 people show up to the first meeting, and everybody's so enthusiastic wanting to volunteer. So we made this nonprofit, which basically does anything we can to spread the plant-based message, anywhere from lectures in the community from physicians and other healthcare providers, to potlucks and to doing charity events and feeding underserved population. You name it. We've done so many different things, and it's grown to thousands of members. COVID obviously put a little bit of a damper on it, but it's going strong. I'm not as involved anymore as I used to be now that I moved out to California, but I'm looking to create a little bit of a branch out here as well. Initially, the idea was to get branches in every single city and kind of do almost similar to what the Plant Pure Nation pods were doing. But then we decided, well, you know what, they have a nice system going, and why should we compete? So we kind of work alongside the Plant Pure Nation pods. That's been a wonderful thing for sure. I have a website, heartstrong.com, which was up for a while and is still kind of undergoing some development, which is meant to be a online do-it-yourself lifestyle medicine program, right? Because this is not available everywhere. It doesn't make a lot of money, but hey, if you go step 1, step 2, step 3, and slowly watch videos, educate yourself, it's kind of a do-it-yourself way to focus on heart disease prevention. So that's one of my other big projects that I'm working on. And now, of course, with everything that happened in the Monterey Bay Half Marathon, and after being on the Today Show and all these other big venues that came out of that, we're doing a lot more with prevention and CPR advocacy. But I still emphasize, it's great to get somebody back from a cardiac arrest. It's even better to prevent the cardiac arrest from happening in the first place. And the way you do that is a plant-based diet. And, honestly, it's a little frustrating talking to the Washington Post, USA Today, Runner's World, and then being on the Today Show. Every single one I mentioned, plant-based diet, prevention is the most important thing. None of them mention plant-based diet at all in their articles and their publications. None of them. The media doesn't want to talk about this. They wanted to emphasize the miraculous saving of the 2 runners, which is great and wonderful. And again, promoting CPR is awesome, but the message has to be right. We got to message out the healthy eating, the plant-based diet. So the Today Show at the very end, he did say, Dr. Lome made me promise to say everybody should eat healthy and work on prevention. He said that, but he didn't define what eat healthy means. And of course, no American knows what that means. If you say eat healthy, they don't get it. So it is frustrating, but I'm hoping to still use this national attention to continue to promote the plant-based message as much as possible.
You will.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
I want to end with just a bit of hope for people. I hear quite often people that are interested maybe in trying a plant-based diet because they have cardiovascular disease risk. Maybe their arteries are starting to be blocked or crowded with butter. And I think the thing I most often hear is, if I were younger, I would do it, but it's going to take too long. It's going to be hard, and it's going to take too long to change or reverse my artery blockage. What do you say to that?
Well, Dean Ornish's study showed reversal at 1 year, and even more reversal after 5 years. So it doesn't take too long. It's never too late. My dad was 74 when he went 100% plant-based, lost 100 pounds, reversed his diabetes, blood pressure, got off all his medications. He did it because he needed to have a knee replacement, didn't want to go through the surgery, and he was so big, his knee hurt. He walks 3 miles a day now, no knee pain. And so, it's never too late. It's never too late to make a positive change. And if you go on the Forks Over Knives website and look at success stories, you're going to find a lot of people in their 90s changing and their miraculous reversal of disease even at that point. And so while every person is different individually, depending on their response, it's only going to be in a positive direction if you make the change. And I would say it's never too late for sure.
And Dr. Lome's story's on there too, on the Forks Over Knives website, folks. So you can learn more about him there. But thank you so much for talking to Dotsie and me today. And it's been so moving, but also very educational. So thank you.
Hey, folks. Okay. Back by very popular demand is our plant-powered plate fridge magnet, which you are going to receive for free if you leave us a rating and a review on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. So here are the details. Just write your quick review. Does not need to be long, does not need to be a whole story. Just be honest and speak from the heart. Then take a quick screenshot of the review you wrote and email it to us at podcast@switch4good.org. That's podcast@switch4good.org. And include your mailing address so we can send you a power plate. We are doing this because the more reviews we garner, the higher we go in search results, which means more folks will learn about our podcast. So the power is in your hands. Leave us a review and zoom, your power plate arrives at your doorstep.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switch4good.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.